Tim. Tim!
It is Wednesday, my dudes. Welcome back to another 4+ video. I am your host for today, Mr. Ratio. Today we shall be continuing the maddening and frightful tale that is Marble Hornets. This video will go over the first half of Season 3, which is about 5 hours long, so bear with me as I struggle through this mukbang of a season. For those of you who are out of the loop, Marble Hornets is an early internet web series that came out in 2009 and centers on the creepypasta figure Slenderman, or also called the Operator in the series. We've already covered the first 2 seasons, so editor, catch them up real quick. Got it? Too bad. If you don't, go ahead and catch up on those first 2 seasons, and come back to us when you're at a higher level. Now, for the rest of us, let us continue the madhouse adventures of Jay and Alex, and let's see if we can finally get some answers as to what the hell is going on. Wait, before I let you in with your fake ID, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us on our socials, and join that Coolio Discord we got. We also have a gaming channel if that is of any interest to you.
I hear footsteps. Okay.
All the links will be in the description. Alright, now you can enter, and we can have a hell of a time. Entry 53. We begin this season with entry 53, which begins with Jay starting the entry by explaining how he is trying to figure out why Tim has been seen downtown, and how to find him again after he first saw him a few months ago. What was strange is the location that Jay saw Tim is pretty far from where Marble Hornets was filmed, so it's strange that both Tim and Alex are in the same area. He saw Tim leaving an antique store in the last entry, but upon investigating, the store is in the process of going out of business, so it's usually closed. Jay decides to wait until the store is open to talk to an employee and see if he can find out any more info about Tim. After talking to the employee, Jay discovers that Tim has been going to a doctor nearby. So, Jay waltzes over to the nearest office, which turns out to be a mental health clinic. Jay decides to wait outside to see if he comes across Tim by any chance over the next week. Yesterday at 11, Tim walks by and does a Walter White cough, and Jay stops him to ask if Tim recognizes him. Tim says no, not really, and Jay explains that he's working on Marble Hornets again, and he asks Tim for his help. Tim reluctantly agrees and says he's running late to his appointment, and he heads inside. Jay waits for him outside and they exchange numbers. Later, while walking on a bridge, Jay receives a phone call from Tim. Tim explains that he has had some old tapes from Marble Hornets that he forgot to give back to Alex, and he offers to give them to Jay, and Jay agrees. Jay ends the entry by saying he doesn't know if the tapes will be useful, but he'll take any leads right now, in pursuit of his answers. Entry 54. This entry begins with Jay driving to pick up the tapes from Tim at his job downtown. Tim hands over the drug bag and questions why Jay has a camera strapped to him, and Jay comes up with an excuse that he's just filming some behind-the-scenes content for Marble Hornets, and in the process of getting all of Alex's stuff together. Tim says he doesn't know what's on the tapes, but they were shot with one of Alex's cameras, and the tapes are Jay's now. Jay says he has begun watching the tapes, and all of them are unnumbered and undated. The next tape he begins showing is some behind the scenes of Jay, Tim, and Seth running to Tim's place in the pouring rain, referencing that something they had done was exciting. It's mentioned that Alex went home to change and would be back later. Everyone else departs since what is assumed to have been filming is wrapped for the day. Next, the tape cuts inside of Tim's place with Alex holding the camera and Tim playing the ukulele. Brian enters the room and the trio discuss making some music for Marble Hornets and that they have enough footage for a trailer. Suddenly, the lights go out and Tim shimmies in the dark to try to find the breaker box. Oh my god, Tim is playing Phasmophobia. Before he is successful, the lights turn back on, and our main man, the operator, decides to crash the party and stand menacingly in the corner of the room. But Tim doesn't seem to even notice him there. The lights go out again, and in the dark, we can hear some audio distortion as Tim rummages around trying to get the breaker working, but to no avail. He does, however, find a flashlight. Oh my god, like the Slenderman game! And heads back to Alex and Brian. They get back to talking about some acoustic options for the music, and as the camera focuses on Alex, the audio distorts. Suddenly, a pair of legs quickly walk through the doorway next to Alex, and the tape cuts off. This ends the entry. Entry 55. This entry begins with another tape Jay was going through, which seems to take place at the end of one of the day's shoots, like the previous tape. Tim, Alex, and Brian walk together outside through a suburban area, talking about shooting locations for Marble Hornets. Tim mentions he knows of an abandoned hospital that they could pass off as a school, but it's pretty far away. Alex agrees, and they decide to head there on Saturday to check it out. The tape cuts to Alex directing Brian for the next shot that they're going to be filming, and Tim receives a phone call from presumably his doctor. He mentions his symptoms being headaches, paranoia, trouble sleeping, and that he's had these symptoms before. Tim ends the call and goes back to helping set up the shot with Alex and Brian. Jay explains that Tim's symptoms seem to line up with Alex's symptoms, and he presumes that the symptoms eventually lead to Tim becoming the masked figure later on. Jay says he only has a few tapes left from Tim to finish. Entry 56. This tape begins with Tim talking to Alex as they walk along some train tracks. Alex explains they are just doing some location scouting, and they're not going to be filming anything since Brian won't be joining them until the next day. But Seth will be showing up later on that same day. They eventually make it to the abandoned hospital and head inside to check out the levels. The first floor is covered in graffiti. While exploring different rooms, rubble is everywhere, and Tim coughs aggressively at one point. Alex sees another building, an annex, and wants to check it out, but Tim is reluctant, and he doesn't want to go to another location. So Alex says he'll go with Seth when Seth gets there. The two continue to check out different areas of the hospital, and eventually Tim decides to take a leak, and he sets the camera down. As Tim has his back turned, Alex picks up a large stick, and he hits Tim. The camera falls over, and the operator is revealed to be watching the scene unfold. The footage distorts heavily, and the operator disappears. Alex walks back into view and drops the stick and walks out of frame. Tim then can be heard coughing, and the tape ends. Entry 57. Jay notes that the last tape that Tim has takes place after Alex attacked him. Heavy breathing is heard as Tim turns on the night vision of the camera, and he sits in an abandoned building. Tim coughs and gets up and begins to walk around, and he runs through the building and tries to find an exit. He heads outside into the forest and continues to hack up a lung as he traverses the forest. He eventually has a huge cough fit, and the footage cuts to Tim sitting on the ground, his hand covering his mouth, trying to warm himself in the cold forest. Tim gets up and heads to the abandoned building, likely the annex that they were discussing in the previous tape. Tim continues to do some ASMR heavy breathing for a bit, and he makes more noise than Peregrine took in the mines of Moria. He then turns a corner and he sees Alex standing there like an Outlast enemy with a flashlight. Tim evades Alex's light and he hides in a nearby room. Alex luckily passes by and doesn't notice Tim hiding. Tim waits for Alex to be far away before he leaves the room, and the footage cuts to Tim sitting down. He begins coughing violently. He covers his mouth to try to suppress them, but to no avail. Suddenly, the footage distorts and the operator's shape pops in screen for half a second and leaves as the footage pauses and has a continued distortion in the corners of the screen. The tape then cuts to black and ends. Jay notes that the building he seems looks a lot like the same one that Alex took Brian in Entry 51, and why Tim even went there since he seemed so reluctant. Was he trying to hide and just find shelter? Or is there another reason he went there? Jay finishes by saying hopefully he can find the place these tapes took place in, and he's gonna get back in touch with Tim. Entry 58. Jay heads back downtown to talk with Tim. He continues to act as if he wants to finish Alex's movie. Jay finds Tim on the phone and waits for him to finish his call with his doctor before Tim ends it and greets Jay. Tim asks if Jay was able to play any of the tapes, and Jay says he found some useful stuff on them. Tim is surprised and says he figured that it was mostly just them goofing around, which Jay says there was. Jay asks about the abandoned hospital and if Tim remembers it, which Tim does. Tim says that the hospital is past Rosswood Park, but that him and Alex never went there. Tim says if anything was more than 10 minutes away from Alex's house, he couldn't be bothered with it, so that's probably why they never went there. Jay asks if Tim could take him there, and Tim says he can if Jay is fine with trespassing. They agree to find a good time to head out there, and we cut to Friday. Jay arrives at the park and finds Tim. Tim says he hopes Jay is ready for quite a walk, since the hospital is pretty far. The two walk together to the abandoned building, and Jay asks about the annex building, and Tim is reluctant to give any info about it. Tim seems annoyed and is irritated to have to bring Jay to the annex, but the two make their way there. They walk along the outdoor corridors and they walk through when Tim suddenly has a coughing fit. Suddenly, a wooden plank can be heard getting knocked over in a nearby room, and Tim dismisses it as just the building being old. They keep checking out the rooms, and Tim makes a remark about how boring all the old hallways are, and he asks why Jay is so interested in the building and in finishing the movie. As they bicker, a hooded figure walks across the hallway, and Jay gives chase. The figure leads Jay outside, and he runs after, chasing him to the other abandoned building. The trail goes cold as the stranger flees in a tunnel, and Jay is unable to follow. So, he and Tim decide to leave. Tim is annoyed at Jay for all the running around, and he doesn't care to know who the stranger was and brushes it off. Tim says he's had enough of this place for a lifetime on their way back, and he doesn't want to be involved anymore with whatever it is Jay is doing. The two head back to their cars and leave. Jay notes that the hooded figure looks exactly like the same person from the previous entries, and it seems like he was leading Jay to that maintenance tunnel. Jay finishes the entry by saying it's unwise to ask him to go back out there again. So, if he wants to know what's in the tunnel, it'll have to be by himself. Entry 59. This entry opens with Jay in his car saying that he received a call from Tim, asking to meet to talk about their encounter at the hospital most likely. Jay doesn't know exactly what Tim wants to talk about, but Jay also doesn't really know what Tim remembers, or if he's pretending to remember anything, or even if Tim's just lying about his memory. But either way, he doesn't believe that Tim is going to continue to buy his cover story for much longer. So, he's deciding to just come clean to Tim when they meet. Jay sees Tim pull up, so he gets out of his car to greet Tim, and Tim angrily stomps towards Jay and just fucking mollywops him to the ground. Tim angrily tells Jay he knows the truth now, after searching for Marble Hornets online, and he found all of Jay's entries on the channel. Jay exclaims that he was going to tell Tim tonight, and Tim argues back why he didn't tell them when they first went to the abandoned building, or even the 3 months ago when Jay first saw him outside of his doctor's office. Jay says he needed to be sure he could trust Tim, and Tim goes on a whole tirade on how everything makes sense now. He explains how he was doing just fine and he was getting better. Then he begins to cough. He continues that he would wake up in his car miles from home, covered in blood with no memory of how he got there. He woke up with a broken leg and no memory of that either. He asks Jay to imagine that, but then suddenly it stopped and he could hold steady work. And then Jay shows up with a camera pointed at his face and bringing up old memories. Tim questions why Jay is even doing any of this, why filming is so important when he's in danger. They continue to argue about why Jay is doing any of this, and Jay tries to explain he's trying to find Jessica, and Tim retorts that maybe Jay is the problem in all of this, not Alex. Tim then tells Jay he wants nothing to do with him anymore, and to stay out of his life. He then gets in his car and he speeds off. Entry 60. This entry starts with Jay doing the stupidest thing imaginable, and he's going back to the maintenance tunnel to investigate. alone. But before stopping at the tunnel, he checks out the room that he saw the hooded figure come out of. Nothing significant really happens when Jay's looking around at first, so he eventually makes his way down to the tunnel. Jay crawls into the narrow tunnel and he begins trekking along. But as he treks along, he hears a thumping above him, which slowly passes over. He continues down the tunnel and eventually comes across a slender doll next to a folder. The folder is a medical file with Timothy W. as the patient name, dating back to December 20th, 1995. Jay flips through the files briefly before adding the doll to his bag, and he tries to exit the tunnel, but is blocked by a series of pipes. As Jay tries to find a way out of the tunnel, he turns around, and the operator is behind him. The audio distorts heavily, and the footage distorts as Jay crawls away down the tunnel trying to get out. He eventually is able to crawl out of the tunnel and runs out of the building. Jay notes he doesn't know how he made it out of the tunnel alive, and that someone was above him, which is those footsteps that we heard earlier. Jay says he's gonna go through what he was able to escape with, but he never wants to go back to that place again. Entry 60.5. Jay begins the entry by saying this entry will serve as a record of what he has found. Jay can be heard coughing before he explains that some of the information in the file has been redacted, which seems more like whoever left the file is the one who did the redacting and not the hospital that they came from. The first form is from 1995, and it lists Tim's symptoms as insomnia, headaches, and a possible disorder, which is just very vague overall. The next form has some possible information regarding seizures, since Tim has a history of falling. Under pain assessment, Tim is at a 6 or a 7 for his headache pain.
My God, so fucking funny!
The files continue to go over Tim's headache pain and insomnia keeping him up most nights. Usually he's able to get about like 4 hours of sleep. Near the bottom of a page, it mentions that Tim ran away from home 2 somethings ago. It's unknown if it's days, weeks, months, hours, but that he was found at Rosswood Park. The next page is a brief operative progress note, which also has the operator symbol in the corner of it. The page is entirely redacted besides the date, January 10th. The final form is a suicide or self-harm assessment tool, which Tim is ranked at 14, which is considered high risk. The form mentions Tim is prone to severe hallucinations, with hopelessness, anger, and the inability to experience positive emotions. Under the forms is a photo of Jay and Tim in a parking lot, taken the night that they had their argument. Besides the forms and the doll, there's not much else Jay was able to collect. He notes that Tim seems to have been experiencing all of this for his whole life, and that Jay may have made all of this worse for Tim. But Jay ends the entry by saying he doesn't know what to do next, and he doesn't like that he's all alone again in all of this. Entry 61. This entry begins with a note from Jay explaining this video was uploaded 2 hours prior to the channel. However, he was not the one who did it. The entry begins with the cameraman walking up to a window of a home, with Tim pacing around inside. Tim leaves the room and the camera holder is able to open the window and sneaks in. The person searches around the room and finds a bottle of prescription pills in a basket, and he pockets the pills. The person heads inside the closet and places the camera facing the room, and as he steps away from the camera, it's revealed to be the hooded figure. The hooded man hides as Tim enters the room again and begins having a coughing fit, and he collapses onto the bed coughing. Tim tries to reach for the nearby basket looking for his pills, but he's unable to find them. He then slumps down and begins having a seizure. The footage cuts to text that says, "Look what you have caused." The audio distorts and the footage speeds up of Tim on the ground having a seizure before he's able to sit up. He begins sobbing and the footage distorts heavily before Tim is finally able to pull himself up and he leaves the room. The hooded man comes out of hiding and grabs the camera. The footage cuts to him walking outside at night along the road. "Where could he have gone?" appears as text over the footage. "This is your only chance," followed by binary numbers. Jay returns to note that there was a storm earlier, so it's likely that this footage was taken recently, and he has an idea as to where he can find Tim, and he's heading there now. Entry 62. This entry begins with Jay driving down a dark road and pulling into Rosswood Park. Jay switches to night vision, and he finds some footprints in the woods which he follows, and he begins calling out Tim's name. Jay hears someone run past behind him, but he turns around to find no one there. And as he turns around, Tim, wearing his mask, walks towards him on the trail. Jay tries to call out to Tim, but Tim ignores him and starts doing the flintlockwood sprint towards Jay. So, like Marty, Jay turns around and sprints the opposite direction, and he hides in some bush, jealous, from Tim. Tim runs past Jay, unknowing of Jay's hiding spot. Jay believes he's in the clear, and he switches his flashlight back on, but Tim finds Jay and knocks him to the ground. Tim grabs Jay's legs and drags him off as Jay questions what Tim is doing, followed by muffled screaming. A few seconds go by and the hooded figure picks up the camera. The footage cuts to Jay sitting in a room, now in the morning, and he's passed out. He slowly awakes and coughs as he grabs the camera. Jay seems to be in an abandoned shack in the forest. Debris and trash litter the whole area, and Jay exits the building. Jay finds Tim lying on the ground near the shack, who also wakes up and asks what Jay is doing there. They both don't know where they are, but Jay figures it's an unexplored area of Rosswood. Tim shuffles off and Jay follows him. Jay says the camera was placed in front of him when he awoke, and Tim asks if it's still working, and Jay says the battery is almost dead. The tape then cuts to black, and this concludes this entry. Entry 63. This entry starts with a mid-conversation between Jay and Tim as Tim exits Jay's car and begins walking away. Jay questions if Tim is going to walk all the way home, miles away, and Tim nonchalantly says yes. Jay questions what they're going to do, and Tim essentially tells him that he has his own problems and for Jay to worry about himself and then not talk to anyone about what happened. Jay notes a few weeks pass before he hears from Tim again, and Tim wants to meet up. Jay heads to meet Tim at night near a construction site downtown. The two meet and argue over Jay going into the tunnel and finding Tim's medical records, which he returns to Tim. After some more bickering, Tim says they need to stop arguing, and they need to figure out a plan. Jay says his plan is still the same, find Jessica, and Tim tells him that's a dumb plan, since it's been a year and a half since Jay has seen her or heard anything from her. The two agree that the immediate threat is the hooded figure, and he takes priority, and Jessica can be found after they deal with the hooded person stalking them both. Tim is able to get Jay to reluctantly agree to go with him to Rosswood Park again, since it's the only lead that they have. They agree to split up for the night, and that they'll contact each other later to figure out a day to meet up. Entry 64. Jay and Tim walk through Rosswood Park towards the shed that Jay and Jessica confronted Alex in. Jay says this was the last time he saw Alex, and he asks if Tim remembers being here as well, but Tim says he doesn't. Jay asks if Tim remembers anything when he's in that mask, and Tim says no, which he doesn't know if it's a good or a bad thing. The two go upstairs and look for any evidence from their encounter with Alex the year prior. They search for any bullet holes or where the bullet might have went from the gunshot heard in the tape, but they don't find anything in their search. The two head out and search for the shack that they woke up at previously. They head off trail, and Jay isn't eager about going off trail. After some bickering, Jay follows Tim into a small clearing. The two head back to the main trail again and eventually come across the infamous tunnel where Alex slimed that one stranger with a rock. They debate on crossing to the other side of the tunnel when Jay's phone starts ringing, and he answers. It is revealed to be Alex, and Alex tells Jay, "Leave now," and he proceeds to hang up. They become paranoid on Alex stalking them and watching their movements, but they also realize that something important is on the other side of the tunnel if Alex is threatening them. Tim begins coughing violently and the footage distorts as the camera drops. Jay picks it back up and begins running as the operator stands behind Tim. Jay tries to grab Tim and drag him away, but Tim is unable to as he continues coughing on the ground. And each time Jay looks back up, the operator is getting closer and closer. Jay has no choice but to flee and leave Tim with the operator in the tunnel. Jay runs through the forest and eventually makes his way back to their cars in the parking lot. He sees Tim sitting in his own car again, and Jay runs up and tries to ask Tim how he got there and if he's okay. Tim stares at Jay with a cold expression and doesn't respond. He backs up and he drives away as Jay calls out to him. Jay notes that something was very wrong with Tim and he needs to find him again, especially with Alex back in the picture now. He has no idea how Tim made it back to the cars before him, but the tape concludes. Entry 65. This tape is from Tim's chest cam POV from the previous entry. From when Jay leaves Tim, Tim continues to cough and eventually collapses as the operator stands over him. We cut to Tim underwater, flailing around, and then we transition to Tim running through the woods, coughing. A shot of Tim screaming with no audio is followed. We cut to Tim lying on the ground in the dark, having a seizure and coughing up blood. We then cut again to Tim being dragged through the forest, clawing and screaming at the ground as he's dragged away. Tim is then running through the forest now, calling out Jay's name. Now, Tim is walking through the same patch of concrete earlier, with a person in white face down on the ground. Tim turns him over and he sees the remains of the man's face, and Tim quickly turns and starts running in the other direction. We then cut to Tim crawling out of a pond, coughing. We cut again to Tim crawling on the grass, and he reaches the cars in the parking lot, and he pulls himself and gets in his own car. We then see Tim's POV as Jay finds him in the car, and he drives away to the annex building and heads inside. Tim goes full tweaker mode inside the building, talking to himself and screaming and crying and just having a whole mental breakdown. We cut to Tim and Jay meeting after all of this, and Tim tells Jay he doesn't remember anything. He gives his chest cam to Jay and says it's been recording. Tim then tells Jay that they need to go back to the abandoned hospital one more time, that there's something that they need to do if they're going to keep working together. Jay agrees after Tim says it's extremely important to him. Tim says he's going to check and make sure he still has a job, and he'll reach out to Jay. Entry 66. Tim and Jay head to the annex portion of the hospital and to the burn room. Tim reveals that this is his old room from when he was a patient there, which is also the cause of the fire. He continues that his mom brought him there and he was never told explicitly what was wrong with him, but he was ultimately diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he has very bad hallucinations that he would run away from. This resulted in him being found in the maintenance tunnel or in Rosswood Park. He doesn't remember the hallucinations specifically, probably from how drugged up he was. He eventually was drugged up enough to go back to school and eventually to college, where he met Brian and Alex. But after seeing the footage, he wonders if the hallucinations he had were real. Tim breaks down and questions if everything that has been happening is his own fault, and if everyone is hurting because of him. Jay then consoles him and says that Tim's not that crazy. They decide to go look for where Tim's files were stored to see if anything else is there, and they eventually come across the nurse's station, but they're unsuccessful in finding anything there. As they explore, the hooded figure appears in the hospital with them. However, it doesn't appear that the hooded figure knows that they're there, so they stealthily follow the hooded man around the hospital, and in a room, he goes to a corner, crouches down, and appears to set down a tape in the rubble, which Jay finds after the hooded man leaves the room. He exits the hospital eventually, and they give chase to keep up with him. They quickly lose track of him in the woods, and Tim becomes frustrated at them losing him. Jay shows Tim that he found a tape, so it was worth it for something at least, and the two leave Rosswood Park. Entry 67. 6-7.
So fucking funny!
This tape consists of the tape that Jay found in the rubble from the hooded man at the hospital. Jay explains that he's still trying to clean up the footage on the tape, but this is what he's able to get off of it so far. The tape begins with the hooded man dragging Tim out of the annex hospital. The footage cuts around and is distorted the entire entry, but at one point the hooded man ducks down as Alex walks into the hospital and checks the rooms inside. Alex appears to be searching for something, and he hears Tim cough in the distance, and he heads to investigate, but the hooded man runs up and knocks out Alex. Alex is tied to a chair and is yelling something, but there's no audio. The hooded man then walks past him towards Tim crouched by a wall, and the hooded man sicks Tim on Alex. Tim rushes Alex and begins beating him in the chair. The hooded man then searches Alex and finds the gun that Alex has, and proceeds to point it at him. The footage then distorts heavily, and the operator comes in from around the corner, and the screen cuts. From here, the footage cuts to Tim lying on the ground in the woods, being filmed from far away. He wakes up and sees his mask next to him. He throws the mask and proceeds to vomit before leaving the woods. Entry 67.5. This entry isn't too eventful, honestly. It's overall just essentially Tim and Jay deciding that they're going to leave the area together since Alex is following them very closely now. They're not giving up on their overall mission to find the truth, but they're just leaving to find somewhere safer, essentially. Entry 68. This footage was also not uploaded by Jay. This entry begins with the hooded figure walking through the forest into an abandoned building. He heads inside and goes to a room with a mattress on the floor and hangs out for a little before exploring the other rooms. Alex suddenly rushes him and knocks him to the floor, demanding to know where Jay and Tim are. The hooded figure is able to escape and runs away, Alex screaming that he will find him. But more text pops up saying, "You will not." The tape then cuts to the hooded man back at the maintenance tunnel, with text saying, "You are afraid," and then changing to "I am not." Jay notes at the end that Alex doesn't know where he and Tim are, and he plans to keep it that way as long as he can. Entry 69. Jay and Tim are outside near a highway talking. They discuss whether it was smart to leave and if they should really be where they are currently, and Jay says that they would have had to come out here eventually. Even though they were a step ahead in avoiding Alex, their luck would have run out eventually. Tim pops some of his pills and he says they seem to be working, since he's taking one every couple of hours. Jay notes after a few days of driving, he and Tim are back in the area that they used to live, where Alex originally gave Jay the original Marble Hornet tapes. They backtrack and investigate old Marble Hornet shooting locations and find something of interest near the Red Tower. Tim climbs the tower but doesn't find anything before Jay tells him to hide and ducks inside the tower. Jay says that he was convinced that someone is watching them from the forest, but upon exiting the tower, Tim doesn't see anyone in the area. They decide to leave after this supposed encounter, and Jay trips on a hole in the ground while they're leaving. When they investigate the hole, they find burnt tapes buried inside. They search the area and find more holes with different tapes in varying conditions, some almost completely untouched. They gather as many tapes as they can before they leave, and this concludes Entry 69. So, we shall be stopping there for today's video. Season 3 is a beefcake, and I shall be covering the other half in the next video I do, since we're barely halfway through the season. A lot has happened so far, and we've got some answers, mainly in regards to what's going on with Tim, and at least, Jay has a new friend now, even if their relationship was a little bit rocky at first. We still don't know what Alex is up to, or the hooded man, or even the operator really, but it certainly feels like we're getting close to some kind of answer with these characters. As for what is on the untouched tapes, that is yet to be seen, and we will hopefully get some more answers in the following entries. I cannot wait to get into the rest of it with you guys, and please let us know what you think, and just what you've thought so far of these entries, and as well as the past seasons. I thank you for making it this far along if you're still here, and I hope you enjoyed your time with me today. Be sure to check out our other videos, like, sub, share, follow our socials, Any of that stuff helps out immensely. I shall see you all later. See ya.